In the shadow of the Tower of London, where whispers of betrayal and cruelty echo through time, Anne Boleyn's tragic fate was sealed in the most unforgiving manner. Once a queen crowned in Westminster Abbey, she was reduced to a pawn in a game of power, her life cut short by accusations that were as hollow as the walls of the tower she walked within. The woman who had graced the throne, who had once held power beside her king, was now a prisoner, watched by spies, manipulated by her enemies, and abandoned by those she loved. Her laughter, hollow and desperate, rang through the cold stone walls, as her mind slowly unraveled under the weight of unjust accusations and psychological torture. Her trial, a mere formality, was doomed from the start, with every detail prearranged. But it wasn't just her death that shocked the world. It was the revelation of how easily power can corrupt justice, how a kingdom can turn its back on truth, and how a woman's fate could be decided before she even entered the courtroom. This is the story of Anne Boleyn's execution, and the far-reaching consequences it had on the very heart of England. The heavy iron gates of the tower creaked open, and Anne Boleyn, once the crowned Queen of England, was led into the fortress that would become her prison. In an instant, the grandeur of her former life faded into the cold, oppressive stone walls. Her royal status meant nothing now. She was no longer the woman who had graced the court of Henry VIII. She was a prisoner, awaiting her fate. As the guards escorted her inside, she looked up at Sir William Kingston, the constable of the tower, and asked, "Master Kingston, shall I go into a dungeon?" Kingston, maintaining his composure, replied, "No, madam. You will enter the same accommodations you stayed in during your coronation." It was a cruel irony. The very rooms where she had once been celebrated and anointed as queen now became her tomb. Anne's reaction, however, was not one of fear or anger, but of something far more unsettling. She let out a burst of laughter. But it wasn't the joyful sound of a woman still holding on to her dignity. It was the hollow, fractured laugh of someone on the edge, teetering between sanity and despair. Every word, every action was recorded, monitored by those who sought to break her spirit. The psychological torture had already begun, and it would only grow worse with each passing day. The walls of the tower had ears, and every word Anne spoke was being watched, documented, and dissected by those who surrounded her. The psychological assault was as brutal as the physical confinement. Lady Kingston, the constable's wife, along with 3 other women in waiting, was not there to offer comfort, but to betray her trust. These women, who had once been her companions, were now spies. Reporting back every moment of Anne's unraveling, they documented her prayers, her fleeting moments of hope, and the eerie fluctuations between hysterical laughter and violent tears that marked her days. Anne was no longer a queen, no longer the poised woman who had commanded the respect of an empire. She was a prisoner, and the weight of that reality slowly crushed her spirit. She paced her chamber endlessly, her mind spiraling deeper into despair. The isolation and betrayal left her desperate for any means to prove her innocence. "I hear that I should be accused with 3 men," she once said to Sir Kingston, "and I can say no more but nay, without I should open my body." She had reached the point where she was willing to humiliate herself, offering to have her innocence tested through the most degrading means possible. But her words, no matter how desperate, were nothing more than a fleeting attempt to regain control over a situation that had long been out of her hands. The psychological warfare had broken her, and she was now fully exposed, her every move laid bare for all to see. The delay was a cruel twist of fate, an added layer to Anne's torment that cut deeper than the prospect of her impending death. Her execution, originally set for May 18th, was a certainty she had already reconciled with. For days Anne had prayed, prepared her soul, and mentally said her final goodbyes. finding some semblance of peace in the inevitability of death. But as the sun rose on May 18th, she was informed that the execution would be postponed. The new date? May 19th. No explanation, no reason. Just an added weight of uncertainty that plunged Anne back into the depths of her anguish. Each passing day felt like an eternity, as Anne was forced to endure the cruel manipulation of hope. She knew the end was near, but the uncertainty of when it would come gnawed at her sanity. The mental and emotional toll of waiting, of being so close to death yet never knowing when it would strike, became a form of torture in itself. It wasn't just the thought of dying, it was the relentless waiting, the cruel stretching of her suffering. By the morning of May 19th, Anne had been broken completely. Her spirit, once defiant, now seemed weary and resigned. Death, once feared, now seemed like a mercy, a release from the endless psychological torment she had endured. The crown she once wore now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the certainty that the end was all that remained. As the days dragged on in the cold, oppressive walls of the tower, Anne's thoughts constantly returned to her family. She asked time and time again about her father, Thomas Boleyn, and her brother George, but no one came. Her father, once a powerful figure in court, had abandoned her, leaving her to face her fate alone. In his desperation to save himself, Thomas had cast aside his daughter, choosing survival over loyalty. The same betrayal came from her brother George, who was imprisoned alongside her, awaiting his own execution. Anne's world was shrinking, and the people she had loved and trusted had turned their backs on her when she needed them most. She was surrounded by enemies, spies, conspirators, and those eager to see her fall. It was a betrayal of the highest order, one that cut deeper than any blade. She was isolated, completely alone in her suffering. The very family who had once celebrated her rise to the throne now chose self-preservation over loyalty, leaving Anne to face the unthinkable with no support. Every attempt to understand her fate, every question about her family's whereabouts, was met with silence. The walls closed in, and Anne was left to confront the cruelty of the court and the devastating realization that those who should have defended her were instead complicit in her demise. The trial that unfolded on May 15th was nothing more than a grotesque spectacle, a tragic mockery of justice. The entire event had been orchestrated long before Anne even set foot in the courtroom. Henry VIII, ever the puppet master, had already told Jane Seymour that Anne would be sentenced that very day, a clear signal that the verdict was a foregone conclusion. The trial was a mere formality, designed to give the illusion of legal process, while the outcome had already been sealed in the dark chambers of power. The jury, rather than being composed of impartial figures, was stacked with Anne's most bitter enemies. Chief among them was her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who not only presided over the proceedings but also played an active role in condemning her. The betrayal ran deep. Anne, already weakened by the psychological torment of her imprisonment, was not even given the basic rights afforded to any accused. She wasn't told what the charges were until she walked into the courtroom, and she was denied the opportunity to defend herself. No witnesses were called in her favor, and the prosecution had no solid evidence. Yet, the jury, composed entirely of those who had a vested interest in her downfall, returned a guilty verdict, sealing her fate. It was a trial by design, one that had been rigged from the start. Henry's decision to have Anne executed by a French swordsman instead of the customary axe was shrouded in a thin veil of mercy. But in truth, it was yet another layer of psychological torment. At first glance, it seemed like a gesture of kindness, a quick, clean death by sword, rather than the brutal, clumsy execution by axe. But the reality was far darker. The delay in the arrival of the French executioner stretched Anne's suffering, turning each moment of waiting into an agonizing eternity. The man who was supposed to bring an end to her pain became another instrument of torture, his absence only heightening her psychological unraveling. The choice of a foreign executioner was no mere technicality. It was a calculated insult. It reinforced Anne's alienation, her status as an outsider, in a kingdom that had once been hers. She had been queen, revered and anointed. But now, she was reduced to an object of foreign execution, a humiliating reminder that despite her crown, she was not truly English in the eyes of her husband or her country. It was as if Henry, in his ruthless paranoia, sought to strip away every last shred of Anne's identity, leaving her a figure of foreignness, unworthy even of the dignity of an English death. As dawn broke on May 19, Anne Boleyn was no longer the radiant queen who had once captivated the court. The woman who had dazzled with her intelligence, her beauty, and her sharp wit was now a figure of ethereal calm, her transformation striking in its starkness. Witnesses described her as almost ghostly, pale and composed, wearing a simple gray gown that stood in sharp contrast to the opulence she had once known. Her once vibrant eyes, full of life and ambition, now seemed distant, as though she had already stepped beyond this world. Something was unnerving about her calm demeanor. She had transcended fear, but in doing so, she seemed to embrace something far more unsettling. A kind of surrender, as though she had fully accepted her fate. It was not the quiet bravery of someone prepared to meet their end with dignity. It was the eerie stillness of a woman who had been broken by the cruelty of her circumstances. In the face of death, Anne's defiance had faded, leaving only an acceptance that felt less like peace and more like the chilling resignation of one who had been worn down to nothing. Her calmness was almost unnatural, and those who looked upon her saw not a queen, but a shadow of a woman, consumed by the weight of her torment. Anne Boleyn had become a ghost long before she ever reached the scaffold. As Anne Boleyn made her way toward the scaffold, the silence of the crowd was deafening, but Anne's mind was anything but still. In a final haunting moment of defiance, or perhaps desperation, she turned to her women-in-waiting, and with a twisted smile remarked, "I hear the executioner is very good, and I have a little neck." The words hung in the air, her voice almost too calm, as she lightly touched her throat, a chilling gesture of acceptance. It wasn't a gallows joke. It wasn't an attempt to lighten the mood. No, this was something far darker. It was the cruel result of a mind shattered by days of psychological torture, her spirit ground down by betrayal, false accusations, and isolation. Anne's laughter, though soft, echoed unnervingly. Her attempt to make light of her own beheading wasn't bravery. It was a symptom of a broken woman, one who had been pushed to the edge of sanity. The woman who had once dazzled Europe with her charm and wit was now a shell, hollowed out by fear, grief, and torment. The horrific reality was that this was no longer a joke. It was the last defense of a person stripped of all hope, using humor as her final escape from the crushing weight of inevitability. Anne Boleyn's final moments were as haunting as the tragic spectacle that led her to the scaffold. As she knelt before the French executioner, poised and unnervingly calm, the world around her seemed to hold its breath. The crowd, witnesses, and even her executioner felt the weight of the moment. This was no ordinary death. The executioner, trained and precise, raised his sword, and in one swift, clean motion, Anne's life was severed from her body. For a few moments, an eerie stillness followed, broken only by the soft rustling of the wind. Yet, in that brief silence, something unsettling happened. Witnesses reported that, even after her head had fallen, Anne's lips continued to move, seemingly in prayer. Was it a mere muscle contraction, a last involuntary twitch of a body left behind? Or was it something more, a sign of lingering consciousness, a final moment of defiance, or perhaps of surrender to the divine. The image of her lips moving in silent prayer after her death was burned into the minds of all who witnessed it. It was a moment that blurred the line between life and death, a chilling reminder of the fragile nature of existence. Anne Boleyn's execution wasn't just an end. It was an image that would haunt the world forever, a symbol of the injustice and cruelty she endured until her final breath. Anne Boleyn's death marked the cruelest erasure of a woman who had once been queen, a vibrant symbol of hope and ambition for her country. Her body was hastily discarded in an unmarked grave, covered with nothing more than a white cloth and placed in an arrow chest, an object meant for weapons, not a queen. There was no solemn funeral procession, no prayers offered, no dignified farewell. Her death was a brutal dismissal, as though she had never existed. It was as if history itself had been rewritten, erasing her from the very fabric of the nation she had once ruled. Yet, in the silence of her grave, Anne's legacy lived on through her daughter, Elizabeth. The young princess, barely 2 years old at the time of her mother's execution, was left to grow up in the shadow of Anne's fate. Elizabeth, carrying the heavy burden of her mother's death, vowed never to marry, perhaps as a means of avoiding the painful fate that had befallen Anne. But it was this very loss that would shape her into England's greatest monarch. Anne's death, though a tragic ending, became the catalyst for the rise of Elizabeth, a queen whose reign would transform England into a global power. However, the cost of this greatness was undeniable. The loss of a mother, a queen, and a woman who had been tragically wronged. Anne's death carved a deep scar in the heart of England, one that would never fully heal, even as the nation rose to unprecedented heights under Elizabeth's rule. Anne Boleyn's execution was not just a tragic moment in history. It was a harrowing testament to the abuse of power and the brutal corruption of justice. Her death was a chilling reminder of how far a ruler could go to maintain control, regardless of truth or fairness. It set a terrifying precedent, one that would echo through the centuries, leaving a shadow over England's soul. The injustice Anne faced, the manipulation, and the betrayal of those closest to her are stories that demand to be remembered. If you felt the weight of Anne's untold story, if her tragic fate has left you questioning the dark side of power, join us on a journey through the forgotten histories that shaped our world. Subscribe now and prepare for a deep dive into more stories that history tried to bury. Don't miss the next chapter in this relentless pursuit of truth.